If you'd like to know how to paint these shiny rose hips in watercolour to really level up your watercolour painting, then stick around. While I was out walking, I came across these shiny, glossy rose hips, and I remembered a few months ago I painted the wild rose that bloomed here before the rose hips began to appear. So I thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to paint them. As you can see, I've done a really simple line drawing here, and the line drawing and reference photograph will be available, and I'll let you know a little bit later on how to obtain them for free. I'm using Daler Rowney mixed media paper, as you can see, and all of the paints that I'm using are made by Mungyo, but please use whatever materials that you have, and I will link everything in the description box underneath this video. The brushes that I'm using today are a selection from Rosemary Co, and I use these spotter brushes because they have a really short bristle, which means that paint application is super easy, as well as my flat synthetic brush for erasing any mistakes. I'll be using a number 2, a number 4 and a number 0 size brush, but once again, as I said, I will link everything in the description box. This is the colour chart that I've made to help me match up my colours super easy, and I'll link it in the description card at the top of the screen right now, so if you want to click through after this video, you can take a look and make one for yourself. So to begin with, I'm mixing a really watery mix of my first wash, and I'm using French Grey with a tiny bit of Scarlet and a tiny bit of permanent red, and we want to make a kind of sort of smoky grey tone, if you like, with a little bit of pink. Now this colour might seem a little bit strange, but trust me, this will really work for the outside edge of our rose hips where we have a kind of disappearing edge. It'll all make sense in the end. I'm also mixing a separate puddle of Scarlet, as you can see. Now to begin with, I'm working wet in wet, which simply means that I'm adding water to the paper exactly where I want that paint to go, avoiding the tiny little highlight at the top of the rose hip, as you can see. Just working around that highlight and putting the water right up to that pencil line. I'm just adding a tiny bit more of the French Grey to the pink tone here, and you can see me adding it to the pencil line and letting the paint do the work. And again on the other edge. Now, because we're working wet in wet, it just means that it's easier to handle paint, and it also means that you have the opportunity to move it within that paper as it forms a kind of barrier, making paint application super easy. Once I've dropped in the pinky grey tone, you can see me adding a tiny bit more of Scarlet to the mix here and dropping in that paint, keeping it away from the highlight and just letting it splurge naturally into the wet paper. I've chosen this Daler Rowney mixed media paper because I do find it very forgiving, particularly if you're new to watercolour painting. The blending process can be a little bit tricky, but this paper makes it a breeze. But it does have to be this brand. I've tried other makes and it really doesn't seem to work the same, but for some reason this Daler Rowney make really does make application of watercolour a breeze. So you can see me just dropping in this paint and avoiding the highlight. And the mix you can see me dropping in is, as I've said, it's Scarlet with a tiny bit of permanent red. You can see how I'm using my number 2 size spotter just to apply the first wash on this little hidden part of the bud here that's hiding behind the main one, just wet on dry, which means I'm applying the paint directly onto the paper, still avoiding the little highlight like this. Now, watercolour painting is all about building up your layers really slowly, and it's all about having a little bit of patience to make sure that your initial washes are dry before you apply the next one. You can see me doing exactly the same thing on the second bud over here, once again avoiding that highlight. Now, if you are new to watercolour painting, I highly recommend that you watch this video all the way through so that you can see the tricky process unfold and it becomes the painting that you can be proud of. I know that when I was new to watercolour painting, I did think sort of midway through that I'd made a mistake, but honestly, it's all about a layering process and taking your time. And the important thing is making sure that each layer is dry before applying the next. You can see me here adding that sort of highlight colour wash, the disappearing edge wash if you like, to the same parts of the rosehip as I did on the rosehip number 1, and just dropping in a tiny bit more permanent red so that we have a variation between a red tone and more of an orangey red tone with the scarlet. Notice how those colours are kind of gently merging into that damp paper, making application super easy. You can have full control of your paint when you apply your paint this way, taking that paint right up to the pencil line like this. Now, I said at the very beginning of this tutorial that we have a free line drawing and reference photograph to accompany this tutorial if you'd like to paint along with me. And these are available in our Facebook group, details of which I will link in the description box below. Now, I highly recommend that you join us over there. We are a wonderful, fast-growing community, and you can post up your finished paintings there and have some feedback from me and the other members. So do consider joining us. Like I said, you can have free access to the reference photograph and the line drawing so you can trace it down for yourself. So going back to the initial wash, making sure that it's dry and just adding a little bit more pigment to the pigment that I've already got on my palette, just by adding a tiny bit more scarlet and a tiny bit more permanent red and applying it like this. It is, of course, really important that your layers are dry before you apply a second layer, because you don't want your paint to go muddy. So make sure that your first wash is dry. This time I'm working wet on dry, which simply means that I'm applying the wet paint to the dry paper. This seems to work really well on the second wash, and you'll notice how I'm cleaning my brush and just patting it dry on the kitchen roll before gently blending that paint into the paper. If you'd like to know a little bit more about how I blend my paint onto paper and the 3 different types of paper that I frequently use, I will put an information card on the top of your screen right now on a video that I made a few months ago, which explains all my application processes and the papers to make it super easy to understand. So as you can see, once I've applied the paint onto the paper, I'm cleaning my brush, patting it on that kitchen roll, and with a damp brush just blending it through. You'll notice how I'm keeping clear of that initial wash on the outside edges of the rosehip, because we want that to be our disappearing edge where the light would naturally hit that little bud. Noticing how I'm blending that paint into the little highlight. At the moment the highlights are looking far too stark, but don't worry, this will all sort of blend together as we continue to build up the layers. You can see that I've switched down to a number 0 size brush here to work on this tiny little bud that's overlapping at the back of this one here, using the tip of the brush to just apply the colour around that little highlight. Make sure though that the larger bud on the outside here is dry, because we don't want those colours to merge together. You can see that by applying that wash where the 2 buds meet, it really enhances the outside edge of the larger bud and makes it look more realistic. So I'm just continuing this process, once again making sure that my layers are completely dry. Applying in the paint to the pencil line as shown. And once I'm happy with the positioning of that outside edge, just dropping in the 2 other washes. So we have scarlet and permanent red kind of gently merging together on my little palette here, but I'm not too fussy at the moment. We just want to get these colours on and building them up really slowly. This is a number 2 size spotter brush. Notice how I'm applying the paint. Sort of just dabbing it on, cleaning my brush and blending it through. Taking that paint right up to the pencil edge. Now, guys, I do apologise if I'm still a little bit croaky. I've had I've lost my voice a few weeks ago, so please forgive me. I hope you can understand what I'm saying. And just a little reminder there, if you are enjoying this video, then do consider subscribing to my channel, where I will release new content every Tuesday. Now, as you can see on the top of your screen right there, a few months ago, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I painted the rose that was here before the little rose hips. And if this is a video that you'd like to see, I will link it in the description box underneath this video. Again, I worked on mixed media paper because, as I've said, particularly if you're new to watercolour painting, it does make the blending process super easy. So once everything is dry, I've cleaned out my palette and we can start to think about the green tones. Here I'm using sap green and I'm going to do a sort of watery puddle of this. Notice how bright it is. These Mungyo paints are very, very colourful. To the top puddle, I'm adding a tiny bit of Vandyke brown just to take some of that lime green out of it. And on the bottom puddle, I'm adding a little bit of indigo to make it a darker shade of green, as you can see. Using my number 2 size spotter, I'm painting this directly onto the paper using the wet on dry technique, as you can see, taking it all the way down that stem like this. Notice how I'm using the brush sort of like a felt tip pen, just by colouring in that little stem like that, making application super easy. These spotters come into their own when you paint like this. And I'm just dropping the darker tone on the outside edge there to give it a little bit of dimension. Notice how I'm skipping the next stem and waiting for that layer to dry that I've just applied and focusing on the stem of the other bud. And just dropping in a tiny bit of the sap green mixed with the indigo onto this tiny little leaf at the top of the cropped image here. And just picking up some of that lime green coloured mix and applying it on this little folded over leaf on the top. Now that the first stem is dry, we can apply that colour to the second one, quite safely without it running into the first wash. And just picking up my number 0 size brush and just dropping in that darker tone towards the outside edge. And the same on the other stem. Noticing how I'm just blending it in with the tip of that little brush. I'm just applying this darker tone towards the central vein of this folded over leaf, as you can see. Just taking it right up to the edge of the rose hip. Now already these little rose hips have a 3-dimensional form. You can see that shape forming in front of you as you build up your layers slowly. So once again, going back to this little leaf here, and I'm leaving a small gap, as you can see here. This would represent the kind of the central part of the leaf where we're negatively painting around that vein, just to give it a little bit more interest and a little bit more drama. And I'm mixing here some Vandyke brown with a tiny bit of indigo, and this is going to form the bottom part of the rose hips like this. Now, to begin with, these washes need to be really, really watery because we're going to be painting some negative shapes into them a little bit later. So make sure at this point that your paint is light enough and watery enough to apply like this. So we have also a little bit of a little bit of French grey mixed into it as well. So I'm just using the tip of my number 0 size brush to manipulate that paint wet on dry into these areas as shown. As I hit this pot here, this little grey area, notice how I'm making sure that the paint is light enough, and to lighten the paint all we do is add a little bit of water. You can see how it has a slightly more grey tone. And the same on this side here. So once I'm happy with that first wash, you can see how I've cleaned down my palette. And once again, I'm mixing Vandyke brown with a little bit of indigo, and this time to a slightly thicker consistency. So once again, making sure that that paint is dry. You can see me applying this paint wet on dry with a finer brush. This is a number 0 size spotter from Rosemary Co. Number 0 size spotter, and you can see how I'm sort of using a kind of patting, stippling motion to create a little bit of texture and a little bit of form. And once again, I do apologise for my croaky voice. Noticing how I'm applying the paint over this initial wash to create a little bit of form by just wiggling my brush like this, sort of just using the reference photograph as a guide. This is just to give the illusion of texture, and by using our different darker values, you can see how it makes this look as if it's a kind of dried texture, which is what we want. Just continuing to build up these little layers with a thicker paint, as you can see, and then the same process on the other one like this. For this particular rosehip, you can see that there is a little more detail in this area, and I'm negatively painting around these little squiggles, if you like, and just to create a little bit more texture and a little bit more form by negatively painting around them with this number 0 size spotter like this. Notice how they stand out a lot more now. Just using the tip of my brush to pull into these little squiggly bits at the end. You just want these bottom bits to look really gnarly, so just by using your darker value paint, you can create a little bit more texture like this. Now, if you are enjoying this video, please remember to give it a thumbs up. It really does help to support me and my channel. It's a free way of letting YouTube know that you like me. So do hit that like button if you are enjoying this video. Notice how I'm outlining the edges of these just to give it a really sharp outside edge and make it jump off the paper. So if you are enjoying this video and botanical painting is your thing, we do have a Patreon site where we do full length botanical tutorials every single month for a small subscription fee. So if botanical painting is your thing, we do have other levels as well. You may want to consider joining us over on Patreon for ad-free tutorials, and I'll put the link in the description box underneath this video if you'd like to take a little look and support us over there. Right, so that now everything is dry, we can focus our attention back on these beautiful shiny rose hips and bring them up to their conclusion and get that really good shine and glossiness that we want. You can see me mixing two separate puddles. Both of them are Scarlet, and to the second puddle and on the bottom I'm adding permanent red along with a tiny bit of indigo. The indigo will create a sort of burgundy colour, and we can use this for our shadow and the darker tones on the base of the rose hips. Now of course these are already really dry, and you can see me adding the paint wet on dry to create that darker tone towards the bottom of the rose hips. We want these rose hips to have a real three-dimensional look, so it's important that we get our tonal values in place as well as the colour. Notice how I'm changing between the lighter and darker tones. So we want the orangey tone at the top going towards the sort of reddy tone in the middle. Still avoiding that outside edge, adding a little bit of water to just dilute the paint to make it look really natural as it blurs into that outside edge like this. Now, as I said at the beginning, at the moment the highlights are looking far too stark, but we can blend those together a little bit later on with just a plain water glaze, as you can see as we work through. I'm just applying the paint directly onto the paper, working around those little highlights with the brush like this, and once again cleaning my brush, patting on that kitchen towel and blending it into the paper, as you'll see in a moment. So when I'm blending that paint into the paper, you can see I'm gently taking it into that highlight. I'm picking up some of that scarlet tone and mixing it with a red tone just to vary the colours a little bit, and applying it onto this other bird like this with a little bit of that darker tone. So you can see that by adding this darker value, we're giving the little rosehip a proper sort of three-dimensional look. So we have our light tones, our mid-tones and our dark tones, which bring it all together. So throughout this tutorial, I flitted between my number 2 size and my number 0 size spotter brushes. I find that the number 0 is great for sort of adding the finer detail, and the brushes that I'm using are from a series Red Dot, which means that they are synthetic, which I really like because they give better control, I think, plus they are synthetic, which means that they last a little bit longer as well. And these brushes are really inexpensive. They cost a few dollars from Rosemary Co. I'll put the link in the description box underneath this video if you'd like to check out their website. So you can see me adding this darker sort of outside edge tone, which is the red tone mixed with a tiny bit of the indigo, over the existing highlight that we had in place, just to soften it a little bit. We want all the different variations of tones to kind of blend together at this stage. So I'm just using a soft water glaze, a plain water glaze, to gently merge the colours together. Now it's really important when you do this that the paint underneath is dry and you use a really light technique, a light touch, to just blend those colours together with the water, as I'm doing here. So I've added a little bit more indigo to the to the red mix that you can see, and I'm adding some of this to add a little bit more of a darker shadow tone towards the base of the rose hips, as you can see. This will really make the rose hips pop off the page, and you can see all these different tonal values will make a massive difference to your painting. But as always, it's important that you blend them together. This time I'm using some of the Scarlet just to merge the colours together. Because this mixed media paper is so forgiving, it really does make the blending process easy. Noticing how I'm still keeping that outside edge on these, and it's really important that you do. Now I've added a little bit too much of the indigo, so I'm just blending it through with a little bit of the red tone. We don't want it to be too dark. We just want to give the suggestion of a darker red tone when it's in a little bit of shadow, as you can see. So once I've applied the paint, I am taking it to the outside edge, but you can still see that disappearing edge there, and it's really important that we retain it. So just blending it over with a little bit of water, as you can see, once again, working around those highlights. So at this stage, it really is a matter of just building up our layers, very much in a similar way, in exactly the same way as we did before. You'll notice there I applied a tiny bit of the red tone onto the stalk, because from the photograph I noticed there was a tiny little bit of redness on there, so I just added that for a little bit more realism, and just carrying on with the blending process. I've just cleaned out my palette, and I felt like we needed to add a bit more detail to the green areas within the plant. So once again, the same two colours. We have sap green with a little bit of Vandyke brown to take some of the greeniness, and the other puddle is sap green with, of course, indigo as before. And all I'm doing is painting over the washes that are already in place. We already know where we're going with the paint, we're just enhancing the colours, so we're going over the template that we've created. And it really is a case of now just continuing that process of building up the layers bit by bit until our painting is completed. I'm going to stop talking, I'm going to play some nice music so that you can carry on watching the video in peace. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you watch this video right until the end, and I'll see you next Tuesday.